I would highly recommend everyone sit down with, and it is very engaging, the 8-part documentary miniseries of the early 1980s, The Shock of the New, presented by Australia's own Robert Hughes, directed by David Richardson, Robin Lough, and Lorna Pegram. What distinguishes modern art, modernism, from the art which was composed and admired, presented in the galleries prior to the 20th century? It isn't just a term of convenience, not really, though it can be perceived as that too. The idea of modernity was a concept born of the Belle Epoque in Europe during the later 19th century, and artistically, as this series' third episode outlines, it has its roots in 19th century French Impressionism. It is not entirely just denoting 20th century art styles, but is indicative of an era wherein the concept of being modern was a novel, fresh, revolutionary concept. Prior to modernity, tradition and either religious, cultural, national devotion was typically the motivator, the generator, the muse of most artworks in the Western canon. Developments in the arts during the second millennium AD tend to reflect shifting attitudes in religious thought of Europe at this time. I, similar to Timothy Zahn's Grand Admiral Thrawn perhaps, suspect that a species is best understood truly by gauging its artistic output, which would make The Shock of the New the finest text to understand the shifting attitudes of the early half of the 20th century, and why the more abstracted, expressionistic, avant-garde art forms where painting and sculpture and architecture were concerned became the dominant mode of visual expression in 20th century art curator circles. Released at an era nearby to Kevin Brownlow's superlative Hollywood documentary miniseries, also produced for British television, we can consider this a companion piece of sorts, potentially. Brownlow's work covers American cinema, an enormous bastion of artistic modernity, whereas the Hughes-presented miniseries, this one right here, demonstrates the static visual arts independent of film or animation at large, a phenomenon which was ultimately surpassed by the cinema and animation at large. I certainly feel, obviously, although their relationship was essential, and the visual arts' impact on cinema, even as both progressed concurrently in the 20th century, is totally insurmountable, and not often considered enough, as modern art types disdain cinematic art, and cinema types think modern art is just a charade or whatever, or at least the internet cinephile types do, but they're generally utter hacks. I'm an economically haphazard lo-fi filmmaker. Check out Therapy Pictures for that dubious proof, if you would like. Other works will be out, Pandemonium included, very soon. AOD will be giving you a link to that when it is all approved and ready eventually. So I have a faith toward the artists in general, so I'll always be intrigued by other non-film forms, whilst I sometimes think that other art forms are overemphasized as cultural pseudo-sophistication. I also do think that those that solely watch films because, that's just my thing, I'm not a reader, I'm not into art, I'm not into theatre, you're evidently only so into film either, I would confidently claim. The shock of the new will influence your perspectives on human art henceforth, unless you are already educated sufficiently on this topic, in which case you have already heard of or viewed the shock of the new, and it may not have offered you anything new where education was concerned, although for anyone who wants to understand what the state of modern art, where curators, galleries, auctions were concerned, as of the early 1980s, a greater way to then further gauge how things are now, by grounding it in a simpler time first, the earlier 1980s in this instance, is this monumental undertaking. If inclined to seek it out, available on YouTube, I'm fairly certain too, so enjoy if interested.